from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Dan O'Brien will look ahead to this morning's USDA World Grain Supply and Demand Report and the possible grain price influencers there. And he'll remark on a quite good showing for U.S. grain exports of late, this during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Then K-State's Jeff Whitworth returns with updated recommendations on alfalfa weevil management, as those are now starting to inflict damage on early alfalfa growth. Also, he'll discuss mite problems amping up in winter wheat and whether a controlled treatment is warranted there. And K-State's Chip Redmond will have the latest Kansas agricultural weather outlook. All that's next on this Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Dan O'Brien checks in once more to talk about the grain market trends. He is, as you know, a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. Dan, within the hour, the USDA will share with us new numbers on world grain supply and demand in the form of that World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates Report, or WASDE. In advance of that, this past trading week was comparatively subdued when you match it up with previous weeks, wasn't it?
Well, yes. We're still trading within a fairly wide but still sideways trading range for May corn futures. Again, after jumping up on March 7th up to about 780, 785, falling about 2 weeks ago down to more like 715, we've just been pretty much trading sideways with a fair amount of volatility, but still sideways in a range. Closed yesterday at 757 3/4. So again, a very high level of prices. New news coming into the markets during that time frame on corn acreage, which is again generally an optimistic number given that it was lower than the market had expected. We are seeing some good corn export movement, so that's a positive. On the I wouldn't call it a negative side so much, but rainfall has been coming into corn areas in Brazil in particular, so that's more of a positive thing in terms of world supplies that are coming out there. And in the last day or so, there's been some action from China in world corn markets coming to the U.S. So we've had generally pretty positive news. The corn market haven't fallen off. And are coming into the time frame when, again, if you listen to Market Talk and when people look at D's corn futures closing yesterday at over $7 at 709, there's talk of how D's corn could be trying to buy back corn acres from November soybeans, I guess. So I think we'll see exactly how all that goes. But again, so D's corn trading at 709, November soybeans 1466, both quote bidding heroically for farmers' favor in terms of price expectations and profitability, and no doubt if the corn industry, through that higher price, could entice farmers to plant more acres of corn than that prospective plantings report had indicated, they'd be quite happy to do so.
As a matter of fact, futures prices being posted now for corn and soybeans exceed the USDA's price projections, and that's caught your attention.
Well, yes. The USDA has projected for corn for this current marketing year that we're in a price of $5.65. When I look at the futures and work through those calculations, it seems like for this current marketing year that we're in, the one that ends at the end of August, futures are saying something closer to a little over $6, like $6.06. But what the attention grabber would be the projection for the next marketing year, starting September 1st of this year. Futures projections with current basis projected out into the future with monthly weights as USDA uses, et cetera, something like 662. And the USDA's projection in their outlook conference in February was closer to 5 to 550. So a real differentiation between the conservative estimate that the USDA put out earlier, which is basically planning for market prices to readjust downward, and what the futures are looking at, which is at current levels or even higher. So quite a distinction, really.
Before we spend time on wheat, quickly on the exports for the row crops, corn, grain, sorghum, and soybeans, all solid to maybe a little better than good.
Yeah, weekly export shipments for corn, 64.3 for the week ending at the end of March 31st. Need about 53 to meet the USDA's projection. That kind of ties in with the expectations that we'll see in about an hour of what the market's thinking will happen for U.S. corn ending stocks. They're anticipating about a 38 to 40 million bushel decline from the USDA's last projection of 1.44 billion bushels down to 1.40. So a lot of that has to do with strong exports. For soybeans, the market anticipates a drop from 285 million bushels down to 266. When you look at the pace of soybean exports, last week we had about 31 million bushels of actual export shipments. We need about 21 to meet the USDA's projections for this marketing year. So again, fitting right into the same choir book in terms of strong exports, leading the market to think that the USDA may make an adjustment in its export numbers at that time and then move on. For grain sorghum this last week, we had 9.3 million bushels of actual shipments. We need about 6.8 to meet the USDA's projection. So that's a positive on the grain sorghum side. And frankly, we see that reflected in cash prices across Kansas for corn and for sorghum. For wheat, we're still dragging in terms of actual export numbers. I wouldn't be surprised in looking at the difficulty that we're having week after week in meeting the USDA's projection of 800 million bushels, which was down actually one or two reports ago from 850, 880, something like that. They really cut back. Would not be surprised that we could see even more of a cutback on that, which is a hand-wringer, a head-scratcher for folks in the U.S. wheat industry, in that, again, where there obviously are these problems around the world, buyers haven't come charging to the U.S. yet, probably because of the shipment issues and cost structure and whatever, and the aggressiveness of India and Australia in seeking to meet world export needs, even with Ukraine's cutback. So all that said, generally, the market has projected U.S. wheat ending stocks to be unchanged. If there was a surprise, is that the USDA would look at the pace of exports, cut that back more, and maybe raise that. That would be a bit negative for the wheat markets. For right now, actually, world and U.S. wheat prices have been somewhat immune to the slow pace of exports. Again, their focus is on the world picture. I guess we'll see what would happen if that scenario comes about.
And we will find out what the USDA says about all this in that WASDE report, again, within the hour. But to the wheat market again here, Dan, it's not quite reactive to current crop conditions, but one has to wonder when you look at, for instance, this week's wheat condition rating for Kansas, 32%, 32 only, good to excellent, 68% fair to poor. One would have to think that some of this crop condition ground truthing would resonate in the market.
Well, that's probably the other factor that's helping to support prices. Again, you line up the three key states in the central and southern Great Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Texas has a 57% very poor, 24% poor in terms of rating, and reports from within the industry of a fair amount of wheat that won't be harvested. Probably for crop insurances, it would be some failed acres. So we'll see where all that goes. Oklahoma, combination of about 44% poor to very poor. Kansas, actually, we're doing a little bit better than those other two states. We're 10% very poor, 20% poor, 38% average, 29% good, 2% excellent. And probably the more from the west to the central that you go, you probably see a little bit better ratings across the state. So a lot of concern in different parts of the state, no doubt. Southwest, in particular, as you look at the U.S. drought monitor maps, really all across the state, we have concerns about having adequate moisture. High winds, such as we saw yesterday and the last couple days, aren't doing that any favors in terms of sapping moisture. And actually, I would say, as a personal report, in driving through some of that area in the last day or so, any field that, in the face of those high winds, that doesn't have a good amount of crop residue on it is blowing. So a lot of dirt in the air. we're talking about grain markets instead of soil conservation, but the two kind of come together when you talk about our ability to produce crops and generate income for Kansas farms.
Yeah, it's hardly anything but an ideal scenario for winter wheat right now around the state of Kansas and the central and southern plains. Before we let you go, Dan, a quick mention of 2 webinars you'll be taking part in this coming week, and one is on the dynamics of the grain markets. Tell us about those briefly.
Yes, the first webinar starting at 12 noon on Monday will feature both myself and Mark Nelson from Kansas Farm Bureau together, and we'll talk about probably have more of a domestic market focus here in the United States and talk about marketing strategies, in particular pre-harvest marketing strategies that could be used for corn, grain, sorghum, soybeans, and wheat in a year like this. The second seminar will be on Wednesday. We have a visiting scientist from Ukraine, an economist that has a localized, accurate perspective of what's going on the ground there in that country. So she'll talk about her perspectives and what she sees happening agriculturally in Ukraine, and I'll follow up and talk about how those factors, particularly as they affect sunflower oil markets and oilseed markets worldwide and other markets, all can come into play. But the first issue on that will be what we're seeing in Ukraine and in probably nearby countries, especially as shipments try to come through the Black Sea, and try to tie that into what impacts we can anticipate in world grain markets in coming days.
Ought to be loads of good information out of each of those webinars, one on Monday, the other on Wednesday, over the noon hour in both cases, and you can find out more and do register for them, because that's required, at agmanager.info. That's where you'll also find Dan's notes for this week on the grain market trends. agmanager.info. Dan, much obliged once more for your time and your comments.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now, and this time of the year we ask our guests to stop by and fill us in on insect activity that might be developing in our crops. Jeff Whitworth is back by. He is a crop entomologist, K-State Research and Extension. We're still concentrating, Jeff, on 2 crops that are actively growing now, alfalfa and wheat. So on the alfalfa side, what's the latest on alfalfa weevils?
Yes, and good morning, and thank you very much for having me today. When you say actively growing, yes, it is actively growing, but not as much as you would think. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably a little bit due to the lack of moisture, and, we keep getting these showers, but we need some real good moisture, I think. Plus, it's been relatively cool. Hasn't been cold, but it's been relatively cool. So as the alfalfa has not produced a lot of growth, neither have the insects as much as we were expecting. Now, the last couple of weeks, Alfalfa Weevil, that's the severe pest of alfalfa, the one that we always worry about relative to the first cutting. The Alfalfa Weevil has been hatching for about the last 2 weeks. We've been kind of following it along, but they've not just flourished yet. I mean, they're still just coming out, a few here, a few there each day. But most fields have not reached a treatment threshold yet. And by treatment threshold, generally, my treatment threshold in what we generally talk about is a third to a half infestation, which means if you have 1 larva per 3 stems or per 2 stems, that's what we're talking about. That's the treatment threshold. Because of this, producers are questioning whether they should treat or not. Even though they're at 50%, there's not much growth in the alfalfa. A lot of the plants around the central part of the state are like 4 to 5 to 6 inches. There's not a lot of foliage there to catch the spray. Well, that's a good thought. My thought is if you reach the treatment threshold, if your treatment threshold is 50%, I would go ahead and treat, because it's not going to get less. It's just going to get more as we get more warm temperatures, and I'm assuming we will in the next week or two. So those alfalfa weevil eggs are going to continue to hatch, plus that 50% that's already hatched and is already there is going to be feeding on a reduced amount of foliage, so they're going to be doing even more damage. Plus, with less foliage there, less canopy, you should get a better kill. The problem with that, and a lot of producers are understanding this, there's not as much foliage there to accept the spray. So if there's not a lot of foliage there to accept the spray, a lot of it will go on the ground or on the stems, so that you won't get that residual control. Whereas, normally if it's 8 to 10 to 12 inches long, a nice canopy out there, you might get 10 to 14 days residual as those eggs hatch and they start feeding on that growth. Now, if a lot of the insecticide, a lot of the spray goes onto the ground, there's just not that much there. And as that plant puts out new growth, it will not have any insecticide on it. But it is what it is. The alfalfa weevil is a cool weather insect. So they're going to be feeding, they're going to be laying eggs anytime the temperature's above about 45, 50 degrees. They're going to be feeding 24/7. So whether you can get into the field, whether it's too windy, too cold, too hot, as long as it's between 45 and about 80 degrees. When it gets too hot, they'll quit feeding also. But we usually don't have that problem in the spring. That's the time that they're going to be feeding. So, and as a few more eggs hatch, once you hit that 50% infestation level, you're still going to have a few eggs hatching. So you're going to get up to 100% pretty quickly. That's why I say, even though you may not have as much foliage out there, as much canopy as you would like to accept some of the spray, I still think you're going to get a pretty good efficacy, a pretty good kill on the ones that are there. And just go back and recheck and monitor again and see if there's any eggs hatching. I see no reason why we still don't have, the next 2 to 3 weeks, a lot more egg hatches for the alfalfa weevil, because we went into last year with a lot of weevils, and I think we're still going into this year. I think it's just the weather has just set them back or stabilized a little bit, but we're just having a few come out over a period of time.
That's the story on the weevils. Wanted to slip in here, though, a word about a couple of aphids that may be going after it in alfalfa, too.
Yes, I've gotten a lot of calls and pictures about cowpea aphids. Cowpea aphids are probably in every alfalfa field in Kansas, but we usually don't see very many of them, and we usually don't see them early in the year. And we've started finding them in late February in years past, but they usually don't, build up into very substantial numbers. And most of the time, they're a good host for beneficials. So when as the lady beetles overwinter and they start going around feeding, they'll find some cowpea aphids or pea aphids, because they're an early season aphid in alfalfa also. They use that as a host, and they helps build up beneficial populations. This year, starting in mid-March, I've gotten a lot of calls, and I've seen a lot of plants with pretty good populations of cowpea aphids, probably as big a populations this early in the year as I've ever seen. I've seen some pretty substantial populations in June or July, usually second or third cutting, and even to the point where they've required a treatment, but not this early. But I still have a hard time recommending treating for aphids, whether they're cowpea aphids or pea aphids. And you can have a combination. The difference, cowpea aphid is the sooty gray or black aphid. They have kind of, if you look at them, they have kind of a waxy look to them, and they produce a lot of honeydew. And that's another thing. A lot of producers are worried about the amount of honeydew, because then you can get sooty mold growing on it, and they're worried right now with the alfalfa struggling to, grow and develop, if that sooty mold will actually retard that growth also. I really don't think it will. Most of the time, these aphids, whether they're cowpea aphids or pea aphids, they're more spotty. They're more in a localized area, so they may be in a spot here and a spot there, especially around the edges of a field. So I really don't even think there's a treatment threshold. If you get out and look, and the majority of your field's looking wilted, and you have, 50 to over 100 aphids, whether they're pea aphids or cowpea aphids or a mixture, feeding on those stems or those terminals, you might consider one of the new aphicide, one of the new aphid products that's labeled for aphids in alfalfa. But really, if you leave them untreated, I think the beneficials will find them and start helping to control them a little bit. I really have a hard time recommending treating for aphids, but there are quite a few out there, and they are getting everybody's attention right now, especially the black aphids, just because they're so easily spotted when you look at the green growth in the alfalfa. The cow pea aphid's black. The regular pea aphid, which is an early season pest, they're just more green, a little bit larger, a little more active generally than cow pea aphids. But either way, the beneficials can use them to help build up their populations and help maintain the aphid populations later in other crops also. So I really hesitate to recommend treating for aphids.
Do want to squeeze in a word here about insects in wheat and a pair of mites that you're hearing about?
Yes, the calls I'm getting right now are on wintergrain mites and brown wheat mites. Both of them are more cool weather pests that get people's attention this time of year. Both are probably mostly a problem from late February till mid-April, which is the time period we're in right now, depending upon the temperatures, and most are a problem if we have lack of moisture. And so that's what we're seeing with mites in wheat. Right now, wintergrain mites, they generally feed at night. They're generally hard to see unless you go out at night with a flashlight. Then they're readily, it'll probably scare you if you go out and you haven't done that before, how many mites can be on a leaf of a wheat plant. The brown wheat mite will feed during the day. Both are really active and both are really shy. So when you go out to try and sample, they're going to drop off the plant or they're going to run down the stem and get into the soil. So it's really going to be tough to monitor. Once the temperatures get up into the 80s, both will quit feeding. If we get some hard rains, some good thunderstorms, it will wash the plants off. We've put out plots in the past for both, and as soon as it rains, we don't have any mites. Period. So, again, I really have a hard time recommending treating wheat for mites, but they're there. They'll suck the juice out of the individual cell, and the plants will look, they may look kind of yellowish on the tip. They may kind of look silverish from a distance. If you have hundreds per row foot and the plants are wilting and it doesn't look like we're going to get rain for a week, you might consider treating. But, like I said, after it gets 80, 85 degrees, neither one of these mites will be a problem, or will they be a problem if we get adequate moisture. So just don't be too quick to get out and treat for any species of mite in wheat. At least that's my recommendation.
Once more, measure the situation up and then act accordingly. And, Jeff, we always appreciate you letting us know how to respond to these reports of insects in wheat and alfalfa in this case. Thank you for coming over.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you very much, Eric.
Along with us, Jeff Whitworth, crop entomologist, K-State Research and Extension. More coming your way shortly on this Agriculture Today. Next up on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather and our weekly stint visiting with Chip Redmond, meteorologist with K-State Research and Extension. Same refrain in many parts of Kansas this past week, Chip. Dry conditions and blustery weather and leading to all kinds of complications.
Yeah, we've really amped up the wind this week. You know, spring is typically a windy period for Kansas, but it's just really prolific this spring. I haven't done any numbers on it, but I think it's really amplified by the dry conditions, and we have a very little topsoil moisture in a lot of places, especially central and west Kansas. And as a result, we're seeing a lot more impacts. We're seeing a lot of blowing dust and just miserable conditions as well as poor travel conditions.
And, of course, we have to mention here the threat of wildfire is amplified. Lo and behold, we did see some of that.
Yeah, we had about 5 or 6 large wildfires this week in Kansas, with more possible even today and potentially into the week and early next week. The landscape's still dominated by tall standing dormant fuels from last year that are just ready to burn. And with this wind, it burns really effectively and aggressively.
Share with us the latest on the drought monitor. It has to be more intense in various parts of Kansas, does it not?
Well, we had actually a little bit of improvement in the Northeast and then in and around Sedgwick County this week, where we dropped abnormally dry conditions to no drought. That's just as a result from the precipitation the week before that happened on that cutoff day. But that's the only improvement. We saw extreme drought expand this week as well in Finney and even into far northwest Gray County this week.
We are hoping for some sort of change in direction as the weather goes here as soon. And as we consider the outlook, maybe that's coming following the weekend. What's the latest there?
Yeah, there's a lot of forecast model uncertainty for early next week. Regardless, there's going to be a pretty potent storm system that's going to move into Kansas either the Tuesday, Wednesday time frame. And as a result, it is going to provide increased wind, much above normal temperatures, but will bring some thunderstorms. Unfortunately, they're going to likely be of the severe variety, far east, southeast Kansas, basically an extended severe weather outlook for 3 days next week. Those are the only areas that are going to see precipitation, most likely, though. The rest of the state is going to stay dry, and we're going to see potent wind and fire weather concerns, just not the moisture we need. Now, it's still early. We can hope that pattern shifts a little bit further west and maybe includes more of eastern and central Kansas. But it's going to be a hard buy for western Kansas, and any rain is going to likely be accompanied by severe weather.
As you look at the extended outlook, is there any hint of things shifting more toward a favorable pattern, moisture-wise in particular?
Well, we can start with temperatures. After that storm system early to mid next week, we bring in a much colder air mass, and we'll see below average temperatures through Easter weekend. Now, keep in mind, our below average is not nearly as significant as below average in February, whereas our average temperatures in the state are around the 60-degree mark or so. So below average means we'll see mid-50s and then potentially frosts and freezes at night going into Easter, as well as tomorrow morning, too, actually. But when we look at precipitation-wise, that storm system looks to be one of our few opportunities of moisture for the long term, at least through April 20th. And we're going to likely favor below normal precipitation for the entire state.
Advising folks once again as we conclude, Chip, that they do need to take precautions as these wildfire conditions will persist for some time.
Yes, please. A lot of the fires this week were started along roadsides, so people dragging chains or mechanical issues. So just be really cognizant of your spark sources, and let's not start any more fires, please.
Indeed. Hey, thank you, and we will touch base again next Friday.
Thank you.
Meteorologist Chip Redmond of K-State Research and Extension. And with that, our time's away once more. Our thanks to you for listening, and please enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.